there are, there are my personal heroes on this panel, led by Tini. Someone saw that and said, "Oh wow, you've got Tini back." I said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not back. I've been in touch with her all along." Deval, of course, someone who all of us respect and admire for the work he has done. Narendra, who's now a legend, my colleague, my batchmate for years. Apurva, you know, someone who I admire a lot, and I know that several in the development sector follow very closely. Um, Thanks, Vasudha, for joining. We will have a few others join very soon. But to give you a background, and I will get Lalita to speak a bit because she's been really the moving spirit behind this. The background was that one of our really respected mentors, Nilima Khaitan, spoke on this issue to me a few months back. And the question that she asked, which was really Lalita's question, was a question on where and how does the Indian philanthropy work. And this is a question that a lot of us had for a long time, and the only one who really went about, asking it and answering it in some manner was Devar, who institutionalized that and gave us this fabulous model that he made, and we will hear more from him on that. But all of us who have worked in various large and small organizations, mostly large, rarely understood how the Indian philanthropists work. I must confess, for example, in my work with philanthropy across the world, I have seen and I can hold forth on how philanthropy works in the US and how it works in Europe and how it does not work in Africa and how it does not work in Asia. But I really don't know how it works in India. Considering that I've never stepped out of India except for occasional trips up and down, that is a huge confession to make. And therefore, when Nilima and Lalita raised this question, we were very excited at the Center for Development Policy and Practice. The CDPP is a research institute that, as the name suggests, works on development issues, development policy. We have a journal called the Journal of Development Policy and Practice, which is a fairly academic journal, but we do a lot of work on various aspects. We just did something on gender and inclusion. We did something on the citizenship debate. So various aspects of development. There, we are often confronted with this question on giving and who gives, who do they give to, why do people give, how much do they give, why do they give repeatedly, and what is it that the giver looks for, especially, and that is what Lalita asked, especially where the small beneficiary is concerned, or the small organization is concerned. And the vocabulary itself is a matter for debate. Is someone who's donating a giver? Is someone who's taking a beneficiary? So that also is a matter for debate. But to all of you, people who have dealt with organizations on the ground, small organizations, large organizations, who've been receiving funding from across the world, who have been donating from across the world. We couldn't get a better set of people to give us your insights on what philanthropy means in the Indian context, and that is what we thought we will do in this project. That we will do a graded methodology. We will go to people who use the money, find out what they use it for, what is it that their requirements are, what challenges do they face. We go to the philanthropists and ask them exactly the same questions. Why do they give? What are the challenges they face? What are they looking for? And then possibly the most important input for us comes from people like you. And what is common to all of you on this platform is not just that you've had a first-hand experience at philanthropy from both ends of the table, but also that you have all dealt with this issue in all its hues and all its facets, the regulatory aspects, the sociological aspects, the aspects of the of the gap between the demand and supply, and in having measured the impact of these philanthropic acts. That is why we've got you together, and I'm really honored, apart from being delighted that you all accepted to do this. And we will, the agenda will be that we will have a set of questions that we will ask of you, and take this discussion forward. But before I get on to that formal agenda, may I invite Lalita. Lalita, your advice is, you've been the reason we are doing this. So over to you.
Oh, thank you, Amir. I think you've sketched the background very well, so I don't have much to add. Let's get on with it.
A little bit on Plus Trust, Lalita, just a little. Yeah.
Okay, so Plus Trust is is working on women's entrepreneurship. And we seem to have stumbled upon something which is not the usual route, at least so I'd like to imagine. We work on microservice ventures by rural women change makers. So the social purpose is there, and it's a project where within a 6-month cycle, the woman is able to see if her idea works or not. So we offer a fellowship and other kinds of support like some skill building, exposure, maybe post fellowship, some guidance. Those are the major areas where we stay with the person. The idea is it's an education in an entrepreneurial approach. You start with locating women who are willing to do something different or try something different, work with them and get them to start. And of course, once they stabilize and our fellowship is over, then where do they go for funds? So that is where I think my interest in this question started. And then how difficult it is for an NGO which say has a budget of 5 or 6 lakhs, but is doing useful work in the community around it to raise funds externally. Like nobody is giving grants of that size. And even Plus Trust budget has been between 20 and 30 lakhs in the last 2 years. Earlier it was 17 lakhs, 15 lakhs. That was our budget, though we were working with large number of people. So we've done about 100 fellowships, and 75 of them are what we call the Rural Women Edupreneur Fellowships. And a few of them are what we call Change Maker Fellowships, few on animal welfare. So that's the work, and it's very exciting for us to be collaborating on this project with the CDPP. I almost thought that nobody will hear our cry of pain, what happens to our women when they grow up. So it's very nice that we have this project going, and there are people who are concerned about it, and people like you who are willing to invest time and energy to think through the issues, and hopefully we'll emerge with some concrete output, both for the giver and for the receiver. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lalita. Thanks. So that is who we are. As Lalita said, that we embarked on this project with this idea that we will, at the end of it, come up with this super manual of philanthropy, which will tell people, give people all the answers that they want on who gives and why and what for. And for that, we will we have roped you in for this session, but that is not all. We will be getting back to you with what we write and document and seek your inputs yet again. So we have this fabulous panel, and thanks to all of you for having joined. The cliche that this panel needs no introduction is registered, but after that, let me tell you that Deval Sangvi, who for at least 2 decades has been the single loudest and clearest voice in this sector, having founded Dasra after his extensive work with street children in Mumbai. And you can imagine what kind of work that would have been. If you don't, then go see Slumdog Millionaire again. But Deval, having worked with street children in Mumbai, then set up Dasra, one of the finest organizations that enabled hundreds of NGOs to obtain funding. Particularly, Deval, we are all very delighted at the kind of work that Dasra did during COVID. That was really awesome. And to get people together. I am particularly and personally very indebted to Dasra for all that it did to help Magic Bus go where it did. So several organizations that Deval has mentored and Dasra has enabled to become big from small and become impactful from fledgling organizations. So thank you, Deval, for joining us. We have Tini Sani. Tini has again a glorious career in civil society, having worked across institutions and organizations. I have known Tini ever since she graduated a year before I did from IRMA, and then followed her career very closely and very proudly. At the moment, she at the Aga Khan Foundation, she heads these multiple initiatives that all of you know are what Aga Khan Foundation has been doing across the country for such a long time. Apurva, again, one of the pillars at Aga Khan, Apurva, located in Ahmedabad, has been not just been someone who has carried out enormous amount of work in difficult areas. I mean, I go to Apurva for just about everything that I can think of: drinking water, agriculture, small farmers, housing, and you will find that Apurva has not only done that, but also has some of the most tremendous insights on what it means to work in these areas across the country. So thank you so much, Apurva, for having joined us. Vasudha, thank you so much again. Vasudha, starting off from her degree at in University of Delhi, then sets up this really interesting organization working at the grassroots called Mera Gaon Meri Dunya, where she works in possibly the most difficult areas, which are rural areas of Madhya Pradesh, on education and in building youth leadership. It is a brilliant model, Vasudha, and to work with women entrepreneurs, to work with women students in possibly the most hostile areas in our country is something that is absolutely remarkable, and we will wait to hear from you on that. Finally, Narendra Kande. Narendra has an insight into microfinance and on small credit like nobody else does. After having done fabulous work with Dhan and having built several institutions, Narendra then became possibly, he's my go-to person for someone who understands what communities mean, how communities come together, what it means to bring them in and make them stakeholders. And he did that enormously well in South India, in Bihar, in UP. We worked together at the Gates Foundation for a while, and that is where Narendra worked in some of the most difficult areas in Bihar and in UP. I don't want to say much more except that he's a very proud classmate, and the rest of the class really looks up to him all the time. So thank you, Narendra, for joining us today. Let me start this discussion off by posing the most direct question that we have been looking at, and that is that, and I'm going to Deval for the first as the first intervention on this. Deval, given your experience and your interaction with several of these people who give, why do people give? What is the big reason for them giving their resources, particularly money, in the Indian context?
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to say everything you've said about me is very, very nice and most of it not true. So I appreciate the compliment.
I challenge you to tell me one thing that was not true. Yes, Deval, yes.
And we're happy to share that. In fact, some of my colleagues are on this chat anyways. And the reason I bring it up is because not just in India, but I think globally, we realize there's probably about 7 or 8 reasons people give. And the reason I think it's important, at least as Dasra, when we work with philanthropists to identify the reason to give, is because then it helps us also understand what type of organizations they would want to support. And so I think in the Indian context, at least, many of the people that we work with, they could be giving because of religious reasons, they could be given because of legacy reasons. They also could be giving because they honestly have achieved a level of wealth and stature in their own companies that they have more free time on their hands. And so for them, it is, they built companies, they've been extremely successful, they professionalize their companies as well. And now they actually want to, number one, find an area that could make use of their free time. And purpose is clearly an area that they care about, but also they want to get involved in engaged in these organizations in a manner that honestly reminds them of when they started their own businesses or careers. And so I do think there is a huge group of individuals who want to mentor organizations, who want to help them with their challenges, who want to support them, of course, to do good, but also to then sort of provide some of their expertise. So this doesn't only become sort of just an area that they write checks to, but also becomes part of their lives. And at least as Dasra, we feel quite excited when we meet donors of that stature, because we think NGO leaders, including everyone on this panel, clearly have made the sector as part of our own lives. And that is why we see so much resilience, so much inspiration, so much hope, and it keeps us going on a daily basis. And so I guess at Dasra, we've tried to work with those donors who have reached that stage in their life that they can get engaged in this manner. And so I mean, filling a void, I think, is maybe too harsh of a terminology, but it does give them honestly a sense of purpose and utilization, because even though they've amassed great amounts of wealth and built, some of these largest companies that we see around us, they also want to be valuable again. And I think the NGO sector provides that, especially the earlier to mid-stage organizations who are challenging with things, that many times these philanthropists may have been challenged with on the for-profit side.
Thank you so much, Deval. Thank you so much for that. The various reasons for which that people give and why, and the point that you made is so critical, that if one understands why people give, then one is able to identify where or to direct them to which organization, which obviously you've been doing so well over so many years. Because one of the complaints that one often gets from people who want to give is that of the credibility of the taker, of the donor, of the one they want to donate to. So, which now brings me to Tini. Tini, I wanted to know from you that when you want to raise money, then where do you go to? What is the easier? Where do you find it easier to raise money? And in what sector do you think that people give easily? The broader question I'm asking is that when we look at funding, whether it is CSR funding or foreign funding and so on, we find that there is, if you look at the numbers, and I hope I'm right, Deval, that the skew is towards education, and it is often difficult to get money to other areas. So I'm asking you that question. Why is it that there are some sectors that people prefer over others?
So, I mean, like if we look at data says that, people are more wanting to fund and support education. Perhaps it's also the perception that the results are quicker. You can quantify those results. But even if we look at education, I mean, to have transformational outcomes, there is a time investment involved. And I think often that time investment is not something that people are very willing to actually invest in. Development is a slow process. Changing things on the ground requires time. And I think that's where we really need to change the understanding around philanthropy, that whether it is agriculture, whether it is health, whether it is even drinking water work, while you can set up the infrastructure in a time-bound manner to really get communities to own that, to really get the community to transform to a health outcome from drinking water, requires a time investment. So I'm not, while the data might say that, all right, people want to support education more, I don't see that really on the ground. I mean, whether it is working on agriculture, whether it is on natural resource management, whether it is on climate resilience, I think it requires the same amount of effort to actually secure funds if you look at it from a long-term lens. Often philanthropy is, all right, we give this certain amount of money and we benefit, say, 10 children. But that is not going to really change educational paradigms on the ground. That would require a much stronger investment over a greater period of time. So I think one of the concerns that I would like to put out there is the fact that we really need to look at things from a long-term lens, and a lens that graduates. You can start small and then build up. Like the problem that Lalita mentioned, would people be willing to actually invest for small amounts to really build capacity over a period of time? See, someone would not need a large amount of money at one point of time, but they will need gradual support over a period of time. And I think that is what is important. So if you can have a cycle of a contribution, a cycle of philanthropy over a period of time, that I would provide this much over, say, the next 3 years to build an entrepreneur. That is what is more powerful, rather than a single one-time contribution. I'd also like to just put another thought out there that, it's not always money that is important. Often you can have, say, volunteering from people who give a certain amount of their time and their knowledge. At the Aga Khan Development Network, we have a beautiful concept of philanthropy through time and knowledge contribution. So we have a pool of knowledge resources that we can reach out to for help on a particular intervention. So I'd say money is one, but more important is also the time and the knowledge investment to, say, transform things on the ground. So I'll stop here, Amir, if there are any further questions.
Wonderful, Nee. Thanks for bringing that point up, that it is not just, when we talk of giving, it is not just the money. I mean, there are so many ways in which we seek help, and some of that is in terms of knowledge, and that is something, again, that we need to focus on when we write this report up. That it will not be only about pure funds from India or abroad. Let me now get to Vasudha from really that part of the country that is geographically neglected. Then the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had said that why do you guys give only to Tamil Nadu and Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh? He actually had raised this question, and I thought it was a very interesting question. He said, look, all the funding, everything that you're doing is happening in the better off states. Whereas what you need to do is to work in Madhya Pradesh and in Uttar Pradesh and in Bihar. We have seen some of that happen over the last few years, but 10, 12 years ago, that was not the case. And you, Vasudha, in some sense, are a pioneer in that, of having started work in this difficult area. Did you realize that it was a difficult terrain geographically and a difficult sector of working with women entrepreneurship, and did it, and was it as formidable as people like us from the outside think it is?
Amir, thank you for asking this very relevant question. And I think because we've been in this area for not a very long time, but we just initiated our work. And honestly speaking, it's also terrain-wise, it's difficult. And also in terms of the sector, it's difficult to penetrate within the community. So there are a lot of barriers, I can say, at various stages, wherein it's difficult to kind of raise funds and also to develop that kind of trust within the community. So whenever we take up a area like an urban slum, there might be a lot of organizations working there. But in the rural areas where we work, we might be the only NGO working. So just to even to get familiarized with the idea of a civil society working within a space is very unfamiliar. So for us, building a rapport with the community and also engaging with the funders is a difficult balance to keep, and it's definitely challenging. And also because we are at the grassroots and we do not have a head office in the major cities, this actually cuts down to a lot of opportunities to kind of connect with philanthropists in many ways. So yeah, that is there definitely.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is hats off to you. I really I'm so proud of that work that you are doing. Narendra, in the area that you worked with on access to credit. Again, in all the work that we have done as economists, we have forever talked about, thanks to the UNDP and HDI, we forever talked about access to education and access to health. And very often, we have completely missed out on what it means to provide access to money, to credit, to capital. Why is that important, and how, and in the philanthropic context, how difficult has it been for you, or how easy has it been for you to get people to recognize that need and to fund you in providing that gap that exists within our poor community?
Yeah. See, I would like to say, actually, I think it's also a little bit connect with what your earlier questions also. Say, I completely agree. I think the development philosophy is very, very important for, who is giving. Because a lot of times, if you look at, I think I completely agree with Tini also in terms of the perspective is needed. Otherwise, a lot of times just, you're giving some money for some activity. I think it doesn't really take much. But if you look at in the space of, development finance, not credit, because credit is a very kind of small section of the development finance. See, development finance also, again, if you look at, there are very few people who looked at the development finance as an issue and which requires a lot of work and, on a continuous basis and over a period of time. That has not been done. And that's where it has just become like a microcredit. So now you see many people, and actually it turned out to be like social enterprise and investment, and then it becomes like a profitable business. So that is actually the kind of, people who have invested in development finance have seen significant results. In fact, all the NGOs, like even most of the people, including AKRSP or Dan Foundation, Pradhan, who have done the initial years of work to address the poverty, development finance has been one of the key elements. And even to mobilize the community, to organize the community, to build their collectives, that has been a good cementing factor. But what has happened, many of these initiatives, innovations, I would say, have been funded by institutions like Tata Trust in the initial days. Now the Tata Trust focus changed. But I think what I'm trying to say is that some of these new ideas needs to be actually kind of, there should be a lot of open-ended funding, lot of, just innovative support is required rather than just, structuring everything. Because there's lot is that which we don't know in terms of what works and what is needed. So from that standpoint, I think in this space, some of the development kind of institutions which have done initial funding has led to actually bringing more fund from like it has taken the attraction of the government and like IFAD and UNDP. And today you look at the whole SHG movement, such a large investment is coming because of that innovations done by many of these NGOs. I think most of the initial NGOs have done a lot of work. This is small grants, but deeper work. So that's where I think I would like to say that it is important that we need to promote innovations. We need to look at a long-term perspective, and we need to have a philosophy of building the sustainable or whatever the change you want to bring. I just stop here.
Thanks, Narendra. I'll get back to you on this very important point of grants that are untied of longer term grants, because then the issue really, and this is something you and I worried about at the foundation too, that if you then do that, then how do you measure impact? How do you calculate a rate of a return on investment, and how do you monitor? The couple of big mistakes that we made on that, and that did cause a lot of heartburn all over the place. But we'll come to that in a bit. I need to now go to Apurva. Apurva, your take and your understanding on what makes people aware of the fact that they must give. Why should I, if you come and pitch, why should I agree to work with you, with farmers in Odisha, or with animal husbandry in Western UP or Eastern UP? So how do you do that, and how do you make people believe that what they are spending on or what they are investing is actually going to result in something they find useful? You've done that, so I would like to know your insight. You have to unmute.
There are 2 points to it. One is first is that there is this. I just want to share that we have a binary when we think of a philanthropy. Is that somebody very rich and then we are taking money? My experience, and I'd like to just seed this idea, is some of the most fascinating experiences we have had is what we call, in American terms, community philanthropy. And we saw this in COVID. That we couldn't reach, the first lockdown happened. Communities on their own, SHG groups, federations, farmers organizations, they gave so much to those within themselves who were not fortunate, and gave so generously and so quietly. And we would like to think, and it didn't happen in every village. So we did a small study that why did it happen in a few villages? Why? So wherever we had seeded an idea of a good community institute where giving for those less fortunate is important, those leaders did it spontaneously. They didn't require a project or a program. They just gave because they saw that crisis. They saw people without food because, lockdown, things couldn't be sold. Food was not available. The first lockdown actually was. So that whole concept of community philanthropy, we learned a lot that, we sometimes overestimate our own importance or criticality to the community, but the community in itself has a resilience which when you give it space and when you encourage it, it actually flowers. And sometimes we do more harm by monetizing things which are done very voluntarily. So that is just a concept I'd like to seed in, because that is also philanthropy. The other is when we talk to others, when I go, what have I noticed is when have people changed, or how? One most critical one is when they come to the field. Whenever I've had donors, anybody come to the field, Then I've seen that language change. That there's always formal. Okay, you apply, we'll see. We have so much grant. We don't really know what that there is a very there is that hands-off, no commitment type of approach. The moment they land up in the field and interact with the communities and understand the real problems, then you see many of them having a sea change. So I think there is a strong emotional and trust connect, which is very essential for converting a skeptic to a donor or a philanthropist. That is one. The second is that there is what we have seen change people, or why do people give, is that they are human beings, are both emotional but rational. And because then before the check is signed, they need a rationality. So they will then ask rational questions, and you need to have rational answers. You need to get your numbers, you need to get your impact, and it may not be quantitative, even if it's a story. But if the story is a real story, where you've shown differences, then it connects. Then they say, okay, then you've done this in 2 places. Maybe if you convince me, I'll fund you for doing it in 20 places, because in 2 places, whatever you said has worked, and therefore I'll go for this 20. So I think there is a rational part to to the logic of converting people. The third is, I think a lot of it is credibility, not only credibility as a brand, but I remember I went to meet a donor, and then a few minutes later there was somebody else who had preceded me, and then I came in, and this person told me that, seriously, this guy expects me to pay money to him. I said, why? He said, listen, this guy, my colleague, came in the same flight as this guy did in the morning. This guy was traveling business class. Why the hell should I pay money to a guy who is, why should I pay him money? Why? I will be always nervous that he's going to, stay in a fancy hotel and go in a business class. Why should I pay him money? And I think that part, that if you don't have as an organization principles ingrained in you of austerity, where you will do what is needed. I'm not being silly that you go by train every time or walk or whatever, but are you giving the person value for money? Do they feel that, yes, when you give you money, there is value? The money, most of the money is going to where it is needed. And that, I think, is extremely important. And it is, if you are, then there is always a cloud which envelops. I mean, it's not true for 90% of the NGOs, but it is a cloud which envelops sometimes the sector as to the kind of people whom you put up. Are they austere? Are they simple? So I think these are the facts which are very, very, these are 3 criteria which are important. So, then there is, of course, so they all have their pet causes, and sometimes it's very difficult. So we get many donors who say, no, we want to do, what is it called, health stuff, and curative health stuff, and we are not health people. So the only thing I do is that I do work on drinking water. Drinking water is responsible for 70% of the diseases. Does it make sense for you to fund a problem once it becomes a problem, that they become ill and then you cure them in the hospital? Or would you rather fund me so that I make sure that they don't go to hospital? So you try your programmatic logic to convince them. Some of them do, some of them don't. But I think we need to stick to our core logic and our core competence and be very honest in what we don't do well. So if you were clear about that, I think overall that people do get convinced about that credibility. Yeah, that you know what you're talking about, and what you don't know, you're frank enough to say that this is not what I'm saying. So I think these are people. I think this is how people change. But you have to be an optimist. I think most human beings, 95% of the human beings, want to do something for, whether they are poor or whether they are rich, whether they have money or not. That, Uday Parikh had written about it, and you must have read it, that whole extension motivation. is there in most of us. It's just that some of us have the luxury to operationalize that extension motivation and some of us don't. And many poor community members, they do it in ways where they can, with their time, with that, what Tini says, Tini said, and it's a beautiful word which is used in the AKD develop. I love that word. It's called time and knowledge nazrana. That is a gift. So it is your role to give that time and knowledge. So I think people want to give. Amir, in these 35, 30 years, I have not yet come across any chartered accountant or anybody whom I have gone to, or a photographer or anybody, or I am professor. And I've said that, I really want this from you. I don't have the money. I can pay you $500. I can cover your travel costs. Will you do it? I have not got no for an answer ever. Most people want to give. So I'm a great optimist there. It's just that how do we establish credibility and cost effectiveness of that? People do give in whichever way they can, but they do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That point that we rarely get to hear, those 2 points actually, that one which Tini highlighted and Purva pointed out, that and that word is really lovely, the Nazrana, that you offer what is most valuable, and very often your insight is far more valuable than your 2 cents. So that's a lovely point. The other thing that Purva says is that very rarely do you get no for an answer. I mean, that is also so true, that once you build some credibility, then it is very difficult for people to say no to you. There are 2 issues now that come up. One that comes up from Deval's point in the chat window. But before and that is on large organizations funding their own initiatives. But I'll come to that in a bit. It's a very important thing. But before that, what I wanted to ask you, Deval, was in my mind, as a conscientious, tax-paying, better off person in the country, I believe that a lot of the work that we do in this sector is actually state responsibility. And and these are education and health and drinking water are pure public goods. Why are we burdened with that onerous task of filling in for the failure of the state? And wouldn't I rather want people to nudge and push and vote out a state that does not fulfill its primary responsibility, than just make it easier by shifting that responsibility to a few good men and women? And that is something that as a giver, I have always found difficult to grapple with. That should I fund something that replaces the state, or should I fund something that pushes the state?
So I think a couple of things. I think, and clearly this is something that you can imagine people ask every single day. So I appreciate you asking that. I think less than 10% of our country earn enough to pay taxes. And I think that's a really important point to realize. And we have 1 billion people that I think, at least in Dasra's mind, are not thriving as a society. And so you can put whatever economic number you have to that, whether it's rupees a day or access to things, however you want to define it. But I just think inversely, clearly, therefore, we only have perhaps 300 million individuals who pay taxes, and the rest are actually still well below any sort of global poverty line, however you want to describe it. And so I think capitalism at its best is not going to solve this issue anytime soon. So I think that realization, number one, needs to occur, and we cannot compare ourselves to the West because their situation is somewhat inverse than our situation as India. And even then, I think it's important to realize groups, majority of the funding, for example, in the US stays in the US. I think 85% of philanthropic contributions actually stay within the country. And so even in those quote unquote markets, you still have a huge need of philanthropy, regardless of the earning potential and whatnot.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's an alarm going on outside. I hope you can still hear me okay. So I think that's one. I think number two, and we do work, in fact, with lots of NGOs that support the government in sort of strengthening systems of the government. But as we've seen, and not just in India, but other disasters, with COVID around the world, what happens when the government itself is not admitting up to their problems? And so, if it's reported that in the state of Bihar, we had 48 more times deaths in the 18-month period pre-COVID as we've had in COVID, there's only so much we can do when we're sort of just looking at strengthening government systems. And so I think you'll need a dual approach. And I think depending on the activity or the initiative, sometimes private philanthropy has to play a role, to create some of these differences. And I think not just in India, but globally, we need to realize that, as Tini said earlier, these solutions are long-term solutions, but election cycles, unfortunately, in India now are every 6 months. And so if you're looking at long-term solutions, which could take 5, 10, 15 years, and like Narendra was saying, that's how the Tatas did fund a lot of these self-help groups and basics and things like that for many, many years, well before it became sort of impactful, so to speak, that other funders and investors would come in. That level of sort of support, it does not match with our election cycles. And so politically, again, you are not going to find the risk capital required to try and test some of these initiatives. And that's why philanthropy will have to continue to play a role. But hopefully that role is not to own the problem fully, but to enable things then to push the government to happen. But let's be realistic. There are many things that the government will never do. And there is a role of private citizens and philanthropy to fill in that gap.
That's the cue I want to take and go over to Apurva. Apurva, what is it that the government will not do? Where do you think we have to step in?
Yeah, okay. So the government is, to me, first, is incapable of innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So, and therefore, the more it is just incapable. So, I mean, and we have enough examples to prove it. So, I'm actually doing a whole piece on that, which I'll share later. But every innovation you go to in a village right now was started by some NGO. Whether it was ASHA worker, an Anganwadi system, a hand pump, biogas, you name it, all the self-help group, everything which is now on a scale, including Narega, all of this was started by some civil society somewhere, which is now taken over by the state. Okay. Everything, you go to a village, I can give you a whole history, everything was started. So one is innovation. The second thing is the government is not capable of anything which requires sustained caring. So parts of the society which require just caring, whether they are aged, whether they are challenged, this requires caring. It doesn't require just one-time infrastructure, it requires caring. The state is largely not capable of hiring enough individuals who will care on a long-term basis. They have a transfer system, they have a whole system which rewards everything but caring, so they will not do caring on a long term. The third issue to me is that there are enough, because we are increasingly becoming a democracy where the majority matters. We see it every day. In a panchayat, we have multi-village panchayats or multi-ward panchayats in tribal areas. The sarpanch belongs to the largest village or the largest ward. He will cover 3-4 wards. He knows that's where 70% of his votes come on. The last 3 wards will never get drinking water. They will never get the light. They will never get anything. And this is like year after year of democracy. 60 years later in Dams, all the remote wards will never be covered because who cares? It doesn't matter. The same thing. Why do you think migrants, nobody cares? Because migrants are individuals who are not there where they vote from, and where they are, they don't vote. So who the hell will care for them? Why they don't have? They are not a part of anybody's constituency. Neither Bombay's constituency, neither Bihar's constituency. So they are nowhere people. So I think these are people. Civil society will have to play a role. And there is a last point I want, because I get this question all the time. Okay, because we do rural development, we do dams, we do this. Why do you need to do it? Narega can do it, this can do it. And I keep on saying that the government may know what to do, but because it's not innovative and not bottom up, it comes up with standardized solutions in different contexts, which just don't work. Tangs is, or Bihar is full of drinking water systems which didn't work for 50 years. All funded by the Great World Bank and all that. All perfectly technically designed, they just didn't work. It takes an NGO to go and design something which the community can own. And then the state can build up. So I'm not saying it's just innovation. It's just that I'm saying that even a standard government program for the poor, for women, for the remote people needs a lot of tweaking. And that tweaking, if we don't do, their numbers will be achieved by 70%. So they will not do the tweaking. So again, those who are excluded will continue to be excluded despite large funds so-called for them. Even in SHG, the landless women who cannot attend every meeting are excluded in most SHG because, they don't attend, they don't have the 100 rupees, so they get this. So I think our role is basically going to be there, those 20-30%. Last mile, poorest, voiceless, unusual, those are places where we need to be there. And I think irrespective of the efficiency of the state, this will be a role civil society will have to play. I think philanthropy has to internalize this, that yes, this role, the civil society will have to play, and not pitch this state versus civil society argument to civil society all the time.
Thanks, Apurva. And the question that immediately comes to mind is that, of course, and this is what we teach all along, that it is innovation that finds solutions, that enables scale up and all of that. But wasn't this the whole idea behind mandating corporate social responsibility? That the CSR was not really about money; it was about innovation. It was about risk taking. It was about using efficient business practices to come into civil society's work or into solving public policy problems. Where did that disappear? Why did we lose track of that? And that is what I'm coming to Tini with. Tini, we started off with a bang worldwide about 25 years ago, in India about 15 years ago. Putting our belief or faith in those people who had faced enormous risks and had taken big leaps of faith to get and innovate ideas that most of which, some of them worked. Where did it go when we wanted it translated into corporate action for public problems?
So again, I think it's back to the whole thing of it being a transaction rather than it being the foundation for real transformation. Again, I go back to my earlier point on the fact that a real change requires a time investment, and also linked to say what Apurva said. I would see the role of the state and the role of civil society as closely aligned. The civil society brings in the innovation, brings in community-based approaches on what would work, what would sustain. And then there are government programs that need to be implemented on the ground, and civil society can ensure that those community approaches are truly, truly community-led. That's when you are going to see that development stays and sustains and continues to benefit communities. CSR, wonderful legislation. I think all of us were so thrilled about it when it came out that, this would actually bridge that. It would bring the corporates closer to civil society action on the ground. But this short time frame with which corporates work, this 1 year time frame, that does not work for development. Also the fact that it always cannot be around a plant, around a factory. It's not something where, I mean, one has to look at, really changing things over a much wider area. I mean, if there are no corporates, for example, in a state, does that mean that that state cannot benefit from CSR? Why is it that way? I mean, CSR has to be spread over much more equitably. So why are these questions not being asked of corporates? Why are you only investing in particular states? Just because you have your factories there, just because you would like your customer base is over there, does that mean that large swaths of the country will just be left without any benefit of this law? So I think these now see, earlier this year, we were told that there is going to be an online platform by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs where, irrespective of geography, we could actually put up onto that platform our needs for funding. And in a way, the platform would help us identify suitable corporates who would like to support that intervention. Now, we were really thinking that that would take off. That hasn't. I mean, it's still not functioning. So again, you have corporates, oh, can you come and work outside my factory area? No, we're not going to do that. The poorest people don't live there. So we're not going to do that. That area does not suffer from an education, it doesn't need education interventions because it's got a very strong school in that area. So when we are very blunt about this, I think they're also a bit taken aback. So I think this dialogue really has to be there. You cannot go in and say, एक साल के लिए भाई इतना बजट है आप इसको कीजिएगा, ऐसे नहीं डेवलपमेंट होता. So I think that is something that we really have to, the dialogue has to be there. Now, can there be platforms for dialogue? Can there be a real listening? Again, what Apurva said, yes, when they travel out into the field and they see the change on the ground, there is, this was achieved over the last 10 years. These women who you today see empowered are, because of investments made over a 10-year duration. It can't happen in a year. And then, that understanding happens. So I think what we need are also platforms for dialogue, where there is a real hearing of each other. I mean, they really need to listen to development voices from the ground. This 1 year time cycle, fixed, यही हमारा budget है, आप इसमें कर लीजिए, ऐसे नहीं काम होगा, ऐसे development नहीं हो सकता. So I think that's just what I'd like to say.
Very well said, Tini, very well said. Because this is something that from the very beginning we have worried about. When the CSR law was being contemplated, and some of us were very worried about the fact that it is now going to be made mandatory. And the moment it was made mandatory, we all, shuddered and realized that now everybody is either going to pay money to the government or consider it a 2% tax. And that, unfortunately, that's how it played out. Deval, thanks so much. I know that you're very interested in this, and that, and the chat that you're explaining your position on is very, but I want to get you in here. How do you tackle this issue? This the primary responsibility of CSR versus what it is ended up doing.
I mean, our approach from day one, and this is 22 years ago when we were also quite young, hard to believe. We realized that instead of honestly going to the corporates, go after those who created these companies. And I say that because at the time, at least one of our first donor, in fact, was CEO and chairman of Morgan Stanley at the time. And he advised us that he, as an individual philanthropist, had far more flexibility in giving funds. Number two, had no vested interest on where those funds would be spent. And number three, had actually far greater amounts of capital to give. And we've seen that with Tata's, we've seen that with Bill Gates versus Microsoft, we've seen that with Azim Premji versus Wipro. And so our approach, and at times, honestly, we've been accused of being elitist at Dasra, but let's go after the principal who's earned the money, because we know that they will have far greater flexibility to make long-term change happen, because they realize that's how they built their businesses over time, versus sort of a 2% mandate, which rules and regulations and interpretations changes, it feels, every 6 months. And so I think we've honestly stayed away from CSR because of that. And I think on the flip side, we've actually, I would say, that has enabled us to, again, to Tini's point and everyone's point here, enabled us to work with givers who make 5, 10, 15-year commitments and are there for the long haul and really want to understand the complexities of the issue and help solve for them in multiple areas versus being restricted by laws and regulations which dictate to do it around their office area.
Thanks. Narendra, your experience at the Dhan Foundation, how were you able to raise money? Because your model was a very interesting model of getting funding from various sources into a new concept, into a new area, into something that most people did not understand. But you were extremely successful doing that. I mean, can you share with us how that was possible and what those challenges were?
I think one important thing, see, like as I said, the Tata Trust funding nature, not only Tata Trust, even Ford Foundation, if you look at, I think that kind of support really gave Dhan Foundation to kind of work on many concepts. For example, the whole community banking model, like, creating the federations and making them independent. And the source of funding, what you said is initial years, we used to get the donor fund 4 or 5 years. Afterwards, I think we have made the community to pay for their own, development and growth. For example, most of the community finance we do, they generate a lot of surplus, and that money they actually they actually fund new projects, which among themselves. I think that's another huge potential which we have. I think community institutions, making them independent, making them actually sustainable, and then they can start actually giving back. I think that is the model which Dhan actually works today. In fact, 40 to 50% of the actually new investments of Dhan coming from the community. In fact, community institutions are financing the new projects of Dhan Foundation. I think that is the interesting model they are trying out.
But what convinced the Tatas to give you money? Of course, the Tatas and Ford are great. But why do they give money to you?
No, that's what I'm saying. Actually, the Tatas, you see, the philosophy of funding, they are much long-term perspective, and they understand actually some of these principles which we are all talking, even Tini was mentioning, right? So I think that the way they were looking, see, they never had any project they may be saying for project for 3 years, but it was always, 3 plus 3 plus 3. It's not just, like their trajectory of thinking was always long term, and they really appreciated there was a dialogue between the partner. They evolve together. It's not just they just give money and forget. There's a lot of interaction happens between the partner NGO. I think that's where we could actually kind of get continuous funding for almost 10-15 years. Of course, once that has happened, then success is there, then a lot more people will come. That has happened later, other CSR and other people started giving. But the initial, demonstrating the model or demonstrating the work, and I think that is something which is very, very critical, I feel.
Yeah. So the basic rules apply, and they apply everywhere. And then some of you get lucky to land up in the Tata net, and some don't. So Vasudha, where did you get lucky, or didn't you?
We've got lucky in many, I think, in a few things. We've got good people with us to kind of support us in our thick and thin. So even Lalita ma'am is here, and I think I was waiting for this question to be asked: where do you go to when you think of raising funds? I think the people, the organizations that are like ahead of us and who trust us and have like vested personal interests in our growth as a grassroots organization are the people we first go to. So this is something that really empowers us at times which are really dark for a grassroots also surviving COVID. So we've known a lot of our peers who were together, who were with us in many of the incubation supports, who got shut off because of the COVID. The situation has been really grim for them. And we also had a very bad time. We did not have funds. We did not have people to reach out to, and we could raise funds during the time also, and we could we showed some resilience as a grassroots also, who had shifted in a new geography very soon. So this was because of our networks and the relationships we had. These were the long-term relationships who have invested in us, who have seen our work, who have trusted us. I think a lot of relationships very personal. So we connect with people more with the organization. So it's because we've seen people, we've worked with them, we trust on them, that eventually gets into that kind of relationship. It's very long term. I always have this question, how to sustain such relationships for a longer time. And grassroots like us have a lot of struggle, because we do not have a separate fundraising or resource mobilization teams. We're doing everything, and it's often, it seems like not a very urgent task. Why do everybody do it? There are internal battles in that sense, wherein people do not align to the larger fundraising idea, and how do we raise the resources. Also, I often have this question of how do we see grassroots in the larger paradigm? How do we label them? Do we see them as partners? Do we even see them playing a role in the program design? Do we even see them as having their own core, what they wish to do at the grassroots, or just seeing them as the implementation partners? Often the second thing is really sometimes disempowers the grassroots. I've been lucky in finding the organizations, the partners have seen us as like partners in designing things, maybe designing the core of the organization. And I've seen many grassroots organizations who do not have a core idea. They basically see themselves as the implementation organizations, and it's being good for them also. But then it's somehow kind of difficult to become a separate entity in itself. So that is a challenge. So I hope I...
Yes. Thank you so much, Vasudha. We know as we are running out of time now, I want to get that elephant in the room out, which is really this tough question on retail funding, on crowdfunding. We haven't talked about it, but there seems to be a huge activity around that area. All of us get so many mails, and there are 20 phone calls every day. Some girl is not well. Now, where is that situated in this entire thing? How do you all, as experienced, as responsible fundraisers, see that activity going? Do you personally partake of that? If not, why not? Do you think that it is the future? What are the issues there? And how does it play out? Does it require a disaster? Because often the headline there is it's really heart wrenching. Is that what makes people give? Is that how one encourages people to give? So this entire bunch, I want your opinion on this new way of raising money. And I will start off with Narendra here. Narendra, your view on retail funding, on crowdsourcing, on raising that dollar here and dollar.
Yeah, actually, even if you look at today, a lot of that funding is actually happening. In fact, it is increasing, I would say, and that's, I think, what is going to be the kind of future holistic model. Because some of the small NGOs I have known, they kind of come out with some interesting short kind of projects and media and share with their friends. Even during the COVID, of course, as you said, one is the disaster, but even without disaster, some interesting ideas, if you start sharing with your own friends, I think with the social media coming, I am seeing that is some possibility. Because individual, there are a lot of individuals who want to actually support, but they really don't know whom to support, what to support. So there is some amount of education of these individuals about the projects and the possibilities, as I was mentioning, like larger donors, but even individuals also, a lot of young people who want to really donate. I think that is something which really somebody has to invest in terms of how do we create that kind of enabling space and environment and education so that this will grow. But this is definitely a good opportunity I see forward.
Thanks, Narinder. I'm letting you off now. Thanks for staying. I'll quickly go to Apurva.
Thank you very much.
because-
Thank you, everybody, for
Yeah.
this opportunity. Bye.
And I'll quickly go to Apurva because Apurva, you also have another. And I'm going to wrap this up very soon for everybody. But can I get Apurva in quickly?
No, so like I wrote on the chat, for us, we've done retail funding. One was a disaster. So COVID, we got good response for that. But that's recent. We got a lot of student interns, and some of these people come up with very great ideas. Now, these ideas need some funding, but like Tini said, in this great project CSR funding cycle, those line items get locked. So then to squeeze any money out of that is a nightmare. Then there is 5% line item variation. It's a compliance is a madhouse. So to do innovations, then we've gone, I think, about 6 times to Keto, and great results. And out of these 4 innovations, the first microgrid we did in Bihar was through crowdfunding. We had some spare panels. So I think retail. Second thing, and I think it's more important that way, is that it allows the middle class, the young people, the high earning IT guys in Bangalore and Bombay to get involved. And they give some money here and there. Sometimes we push them, etc. But it then gets them engaged. So right now they are so cut off from where the rest of what we are doing that I think this is a very welcome thing. And if we keep on communicating to them, tell them what we are doing, I think we will draw this huge middle class sector which is cut off from development in the kind of work we do. I think it's a good way to include them. So I'm very gung-ho about retail funding. Of course, there are diligence issues and all that, but we can sort them out. Yeah,
Yeah, thanks so much, Apurva. Thanks.
Thank you.
Tini?
So, I mean, just linked to the points that Narinder and Apurva made, I think retail funding can succeed as the way forward if there are good aggregators that also support the cause as platforms for dialogue. I think that's very essential. See, if a cause that is very close to me is, say, animal welfare, and I would like to give to an organization focused on animal welfare, I would really like to know as an individual, where is that money being used? I mean, so I think, and that puts a lot of responsibility on the grassroots NGO. The amount of money might not be so much, but the kind of going back and kind of informing the donor. And why it's important is because you're giving not out of profit that you've earned, but out of your own personal income. So therefore, it is important from that perspective. So I think that platform for dialogue. So how can there be, say, if there are organizations that play that role, that would be really important. I am aware that it could unlock a lot of funding, but it shouldn't be like, a tick mark. It shouldn't be that, oh, today is a great day, and just to kind of make me feel a little whatever, I give out. No, I don't think philanthropy is going to succeed that way. We really need to match causes together and build that over time, so that if I am regularly contributing to a cause, I am also engaged with the cause and the objectives of that cause and the outcomes of that cause. And then that builds that commitment, which I then carry forward for a long part of my life. And there, I think there are some organizations, say the Worldwide Fund for Nature, that have done a phenomenal work in that area by tapping the same people who they know are, say, committed to the cause of, say, wildlife conservation, and then tapping into that. So I think platforms for dialogue are very important. If, say, there is an organization that is working on, say, women's empowerment, right? And there are a group of people who, they are now like really in strong roles, role models in themselves, women leaders, would like to contribute. And then it becomes a sustained support. What is necessary is that sustained support. One-off contributions don't help, I feel, for the organization, That's also one thing. Also, see, grassroots organizations, it's not, they also need investment for organizational strengthening. If organizations have to move to the next level, now who's supporting that? Is philanthropy only supporting you because you are reaching a certain number of beneficiaries, or is it also supporting you and your team to get trained better, to understand better? Many grassroots organizations actually employ people from the area, from communities in the area. And if we invest in them, in their development, that's really going to help. I'll stop here because colleagues also have to drop off, but I'll stop here, Amir.
Thanks so much. Vasudha, you made a very clear point that you are using the retail source well. And the point that you make that that it helps you form relationships. What relationships are you talking about? These are retail givers, right? Small givers who give one day and go away. Where is the relationship coming in?
All right. So we've always had this conversation in my organization that what do we choose? There might be two options, like 100 people giving 100 rupees or one person giving 1 lakh rupees. So then we always go for 100 people giving a small amount, because that's more probability or more possibility of building relationships. And I think I strongly believe that retail does not work in its own way, like on its own. There has to be many phenomena, many platforms working alongside with it, which has to be very intensive, very penetrative in that sense. A lot of one-to-one conversations, a lot of scope of dialogues. That really builds into the power of retail. And I think for us, it's a very good platform to really connect to people who wanted to connect to the rural geography, had this need to contribute, but could not find any reliable organization. So we could not go to Delhi to fundraise. For us, it's like a network expansion sort of a thing, and it has really worked well for us.
Thank you so much. Lalita?
Yeah, I'd just like to share the story of, the recent, the second wave of COVID. One of our partner organizations on a Saturday evening said they needed 4 lakhs by Monday morning for oxygen concentrators, something like that. Vasudha knows the story well. And the same networks, which are, my peer group from my SBI days, all retired CGMs, DGMs who have a lot of money. So I regularly post about Plus Trust, women's empowerment. They all give me very nice messages, but no money. But for this, that group contributed 4 lakhs over the weekend because it was oxygen, it was emergency. So I think, just having access to networks is not enough. It doesn't materialize. But this whole link that, this organization in Khandwa could reach out to that network because they had a link in Plus Trust. So this idea of, how we become a kind of a nodal point for access and support, I think that we have to work on to build up. That's, I think that point Tini made and somebody else also made. So I think that is very important.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. I was going to go to Deval the last, but I'm sure that he also had to drop off. But, is there anyone else? Thanks everybody for having been part of this. Lamia, Priya, Sachin, Manish, Sneha, Ridhima, Brinda, Iqbal, Anurag, anything that you would like to add? Because this has been a fabulous discussion, and several points that we have thought of got clarified today, and several new that were raised. So in that sense, I can only wind this up by thanking Tini and Vasudha so much for being part of this, for giving your insights, for sparing your time certainly, but more importantly, the daan that, or the nazrana that Tini talks about, of giving your time and your knowledge to us, that's been just simply wonderful. And for on behalf of CBPP and Plus Trust, let me thank both of you, and the three who left us, I will get through to them on WhatsApp. But over to you. We will be in touch with you. Anjana, are we doing okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So
adds a comment.
Yes. Who had some comment?
Brinda
Brinda.
has added a comment.
Yeah, she has.
Yeah.
Yes, Brinda, that is right.
Local
You know,
business, yes.
yeah, local business and professionals. You know, that's a great point, and it really helps. You know, we know several organizations locally that work purely based on small contributions that are made from within the neighborhood. So that's a great area, and we will try and build a chapter around that so we understand more of what is happening and what's going to happen as we go along. So thank you again very much, and Anjana, over to you. If you're done, then we can say bye.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Tini.
Thank you.
Pleasure
Thank you
meeting
so much. Yeah,
I've
it
heard
was
so
a-
much about you.
Yeah, I know it's a pleasure meeting you, Lalita, and let's connect. I'd love to know about Plus
Yeah,
Trust, and thanks to Amir for bringing us all together, and
Thanks,
Anjana, thanks for arranging everything. And Vasudha, if I'm traveling to MP, I'll definitely let you know. And see,
Please, you're
come
very
by,
welcome.
Yeah,
Definitely.
thanks so much. And
Tini, come
take
to
care.
Hyderabad. Tini, Hyderabad. आओ.
Hyderabad to आना पड़ेगा. वो तो I'll definitely let you know, Amir.
Wonderful,
I know
wonderful.
It'll be great. But thanks everyone, and to all our colleagues who joined us also. I hope
Yes.
this was useful. But thanks again. Take care, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye.
all. Bye-bye.